Jonathan also, welcome to Planet America.
Thanks for having me, Chaz.
So would you say that at least so far, the most important question for this trial is whether the jury buys Michael Cohen or not?
I do think that's the most important question that's remaining, and it's really about whether he has been corroborated enough. In other words, whether everything that we've heard over the last 3 weeks supports him in a way where they don't have to like it, but they believe him on the central elements of the case. Because the problem with the case for the prosecution is that Donald Trump is like a mob boss. He doesn't use emails. He speaks very cryptically. So drawing a connection between these hush payments, which were definitely made, and Trump himself is, the challenge. And they've laid out a good groundwork for that. But ultimately, they have to believe Cohen when he says that he gave Trump constant updates and that he was constantly, for his own personal reasons, wanting to get credit with the boss. And so he's trying to make credit with the boss his friend and a way of kind of validating all of the contacts that he says took place.
So as someone sitting in the room, how credible do you think Michael Cohen's testimony so far has come off?
Well, I think he did very well on Monday in direct examination when the prosecution was taking him through all of the elements of this crime and the way they, created a shell corporation to make these payments to Stormy Daniels, the porn star, and they, went to great pains to cover it up. So his testimony on Monday was very convincing. And on Tuesday morning, Tuesday afternoon, the cross-examination began. It was expected to be withering, but because the lead Trump attorney who's handling it is very inexperienced as a defense attorney. He was a former federal prosecutor. Now he's defense attorney in state court. The initial cross-examination was not effective. And so people thought, okay, Michael Cohen is handling this. But Thursday was quite different, and he took some real hits. And so it's now an open question whether the jury will buy his story or not. Now, there are people all over that building, courthouses in the United States, courthouses in Australia, where you've had really bad actors, liars, killers, whatever, whose testimony has nonetheless sent people to jail. So the jury doesn't have to think he's a choir boy, but they do have to believe that the story that he's telling is true, and it only takes one of them in our system for a hung jury, which would mean there'd have to be another trial if the state wanted to do that. His chances of being fully acquitted with 12 jurors agreeing that he did nothing wrong, I think is pretty small, but possible.
Now, presumably you see the general media coverage of this trial each day. As someone who's in the room, what do you think we're missing? What's the general media coverage of this trial unable to convey?
My sense is that, one thing that has been, I think, underplayed is that Trump is already being held accountable. He's in this, dingy courthouse, and he has to stand up every time the jurors come in and out. And they're not like sauntering in, oh, what'd you have for lunch? They are like soldiers for justice. They will not look at Trump. They pass 3 feet from him. They're looking straight ahead. They're looking down. And this is kind of a wonderful, small d democratic moment that we get 8 times a day when the former president of the United States has to stand in honor of ordinary citizens. I also loved when the judge, who's a terrific judge, he's really wise and fair and smart. His name is Judge Juan Merchan. And at one point, Trump, acting like he normally does, got up to leave. And he said, Mr. Trump, take your seat. And it was the first time anybody ever told Donald Trump anything since, his father died many years ago. His father was the only one he would ever listen to. This is a guy who was sent to military academy because, as his sister described, he was a brat, never listened to anybody. So now Trump had to sit down like the obedient schoolboy he never was. And there was a kind of a beautiful accountability to that I think maybe is not reflected in some of the kind of headline coverage.
So how do you feel Trump is coping in this unfamiliar situation?
Well, he's been very unhappy until today. So when this cross-examination went well for him, I spotted him. I was a couple rows back, and he was smiling as he was whispering to one of his attorneys. And it was the first time I've seen him smile, since jury selection a month ago. And normally he's very uncomfortable. We got to understand this is a guy who is accustomed to a gold-plated commode in Trump Tower and Mar-a-Lago. And, I don't agree with him about anything, but he's right when he says the bathrooms are kind of disgusting, And so for instance, there are no mirrors in the bathrooms, And not only is that a problem for Trump, who likes to look at his reflection, and I asked a guard, well, why are there no mirrors? Corpse could cut people with them, I mean, we're talking about an environment where you see people going through not the 15th floor where the trial is, but when I've been on other floors, they're walking through shackled, right? This is where violent criminals go to be tried and sentenced. And, go in the bathroom and there's graffiti on the wastebasket. This is not the world that Donald Trump has been used to. And it's great to think that he's not going to likely spend a night in jail on the 16th floor. And I checked out what that would be like. Not exactly Mar-a-Lago. So that's probably not going to happen. But even in the meantime, he's in a form of confinement that is gratifying to those of us who think he's a menace to our country and the world.
Do you feel like you're getting any read on the jury so far?
Well, I spend a lot of time looking at them through binoculars. We're allowed to use binoculars as long as we're not looking at evidence or trying to read lips if there's a sidebar conference with the judge and the attorneys. And it's a little bit hard to tell. They did laugh at a really witty Stormy Daniels line last week. So at one point, the very aggressive defense attorney was saying, "Miss Daniels, you've made this whole thing up." And Stormy Daniels, who in addition to acting in, adult films, has written and directed many of them. And she's very proud of her work as a scriptwriter in her industry. And she said, if I had written this story, it would be a lot better. And everybody in the jury was stifling laughs, So you knew that they had a respectful attitude toward her. And I think when Trump's defense attorney tried to demean her, even shame her for her choice of occupations, I don't think that went over well with the jury. But it's very hard to tell. It's kind of a tea leaf reading exercise to look at them. There are one or two maybe I'm suspicious of. Then there's one, we really do try to figure it out, but we can't. There's one that looked to me like he had a MAGA haircut, but then when I went back and looked what he'd said during jury selection, voir dire, his answers didn't indicate that he had a possible MAGA weakness. I think it's very important that there are two lawyers on the jury. There's a young associate, and then there's a civil litigator who said during jury selection that he thought he could be fair and he doesn't know anything he said about criminal law, but he is a lawyer. And I think what that means, this is just a guess, is that they will listen very carefully to the judge's instructions. And as the judge told them at the beginning of the case, the jury is there to determine matters of fact and whether they believe the prosecution's case beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the standard in felony cases. The judge is supposed to determine the law. And so on these questions of where the line is and whether Trump crossed it, I believe the jury will listen very carefully to what the judge instructs them just before they deliberate. And that makes me hopeful, even though Trump had a good day on Thursday.
You spoke positively about the judge before. If you believe Trump, this guy's basically Joe Biden in a wig. So, but you think he's been fair so far?
Totally fair. I mean, this is just so typical of Trump. I mean, this is a state trial. Joe Biden has no influence on the trial whatsoever. We have a federal system, and the Department of Justice has nothing to do with this case. So that's just typical Trump bull. In terms of, the way he's handling it, he has sustained more of the objections of the prosecution because their objections and their filings are more credible. And some of the defense filings have been so ludicrous that one of their lawyers, the same one who cross-examined Stormy Daniels, she wouldn't even sign them because she was looking out for her reputation in the New York bar. So most of the decisions that the judges made have gone for the prosecution, but you can tell he's very fair, he's very measured, and the defense, wins plenty often. And it's just a really sad moment when Trump and his clown car, sort of they get out of the clown car, go into the courtroom, and then they, come out and they attack the American judicial system. This is really bad for democracy. In Australia or the United States, we have to have the rule of law, or we have the rule of the jungle, where might makes right. And there's a struggle all over the world. And the authoritarian playbook basically begins with attack the judiciary. And then once you have discredited them, replace them with hacks, and then, then goodbye democracy. And so this is part of an effort by the Republican Party. And by the way, I've been in the past, there are plenty of Republicans who I've written positively about in my column. So it's not really a partisan thing. It's a do you believe in democracy and the rule of law or not? And what they call the MAGA crowd, the Trump crowd, it's patently obvious, well beyond the events of January 6th, that these folks just don't believe in our system at some fundamental level. And for them to come in and attack a judge and, make a lot of comments about a case they don't know anything about after sitting in court for 15 minutes, it's really pretty outrageous.
And this is a bit of a legal question, but I'll try it out. Probably the hardest part of a case like this to make is to prove that Trump knew that he was violating campaign finance law. Not just that the payments were being made and he knew what was happening, but he knew it was an actual violation of campaign finance law. Do you feel like prosecution have made that case?
So that's a good question, and there is intent, as you mentioned, that is part of this statute. But it doesn't just have to be campaign finance law. The statute, the New York State law on this, just says in the advancement of other crimes, which is very vague. But there is a statute in New York State, which you can bet that the judge will mention, which bars intervention in elections. And so they've done a lot to establish that that Trump knew that he was interfering in an election because he feared that after the Access Hollywood tape, that's the one where he's caught saying he wants to grab women by their genitals. He knew that he had suffered a lot with women voters in the run-up to the 2016 election, and that if Stormy Daniels told her story, he would lose the election. And there's been a lot of testimony about how he knew that if this came out, it would be disastrous. And I think that's more relevant than that he knew that he was, making an illegal in-kind contribution. Although you can argue that he certainly knew that too, that, giving $130,000 is not a legitimate campaign contribution. There's a chance that next week, as their final witness, the prosecution will bring in an expert witness on campaign finance. The judge just ruled that the defense can't bring in they can bring him in, but he's very much limited as to what he can testify to under the rules of evidence as the judge is interpreting them. So, that kind of thing is a little bit less interest to the jury. And as I mentioned, it's the judge who makes determinations on the law. The jury just has to decide, was Trump the author of this scheme? As the prosecution explained during jury selection and opening arguments, you could think of it like a bank robbery. Like Michael Cohen is the one in there robbing the bank, but Donald Trump is the one saying, "Well, do have you figured out the address of the bank, and do you know what the hours are of the guards, and report back to me when your planning is further along on this bank robbery." So they've introduced this idea of accessory liability. They haven't talked about it since the very start, but I think in their summations, they will say, "You remember at the beginning of this trial," the prosecution will say, "I talked to you about this. Sounds like a technical legal term, accessory liability, but you know what an accessory to a crime is. And you have liability if you are involved in a conspiracy to commit this crime." And we have introduced reams of evidence showing that Donald Trump was up to his neck in this scheme. And then when he tries to claim that, these were just legal payments that he was giving to Michael Cohen when he testified on Tuesday that he worked about 10 hours, did about 10 hours of legal work in 2017, and he was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we have in the handwriting, this is a key piece of evidence, in the handwriting of Trump's accountant, the Trump organization, $130,000. And then he says, gross it up. And that's basically to double it and add a bonus and some other things so that to cover their tracks. But that $130,000 is the amount that they paid to Stormy Daniels' lawyer. And then he gave the bulk of it to Stormy Daniels. And that's a key figure in this case, which everybody now knows. And it wasn't in Trump's handwriting, but it was in his accountant's handwriting. And he's, the chances of him successfully for the jury putting distance between himself and this accountant, who, by the way, is in prison right now and will not testify, which is a whole other story. But it's quite interesting that Trump, is connected to these checks that he signed. And there's been a lot of testimony about his attention to detail and that he was, a real penny pincher and that he never let anything happen without his personal knowledge if it was from his personal bank account, which this reimbursements to Michael Cohen, that's what the crime is. That's that Michael Cohen, his fixer, his guy for a decade, he, before the election, in order to keep Stormy Daniels silent, he paid her the $130,000 out of his own pocket. And then the crime is when Trump knowingly reimburses him for those payments. And so Trump tried to claim when the Stormy Daniels story broke in 2018, when Trump was president, he tried to claim, Michael did this on his own, out of the kindness of his heart, was the line. And this was referred to during the testimony of Hope Hicks, who was Trump's press secretary. And she made a very, very dramatic appearance. And right around the time she said that line and she discredited it, she said, everybody knows Michael Cohen didn't do anything out of the kindness of his heart and was not a charitable person. And she realizes that she's betraying the man who gave her a great job when she was 26 years old. And it's like the line from Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, which I'm very familiar with because I'm writing a book about Caesar right now. But, in Shakespeare, it's like, et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus, when Caesar's being stabbed. And he's kind of looking at Stormy Daniels like, you too, at Hope Hicks, like, you too, you're betraying me too. And that was a very, I think, very dramatic moment in the court.
Finally, Jonathan, in hindsight, do you wish this trial was televised so we could all see what's going on, or do you think the integrity of the case is much better off for staying out of the public eye?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm a journalist, and I think more visibility is good. And I don't think it's right that I'm one of 54 people, actually, plus another 25 in an overflow room that gets a video, a closed circuit video. Fewer than 100 people, and there's no record of this trial there's transcripts, but there's no video record, which I was really dismayed to hear. And as a historian, I just thought it's wrong for there not to be video. At the same time, I can understand why legislators in New York who want dignity in the courtroom don't want to turn it into a circus where, everybody's talking more about, what bozo politician is in the courtroom rather than paying attention to the trial. And people do act differently on camera, and I think it could have influenced the case in some not very positive ways, but on balance, I definitely think there should have been cameras in the courtroom.
Jonathan Alter, thank you for visiting Planet America.
Yeah, thanks, Chaz.